Today we have Mark Burnett again, who is going to be talking about going green. Mark's had more than 25 years experience in the mining industry, and he's had extensive exposure to the mining value chain, including early stage exploration projects, shaft sinking, operational mines, mergers, acquisitions, and asset disposals. He joined AMC in 2018, where his primary responsibilities are undertaking and managing technical geological works, including mineral resource estimates, technical reporting, business development, and client support in relation to exploration and production advice. Prior to joining AMC, Mark was a principal consultant and divisional manager for Snowden Mining Industry Consultants in Johannesburg. Previously, Mark worked for Harmony as the new business manager, where he was responsible for identifying project acquisitions for the company. And I'm going to leave it there, Mark, so if you'd like to take it away.
Thanks, Nalene. Hi, everybody. I really need to cut down on that bio. I guess things just add up when you're starting to get gray in the hair and short in the tooth. So today's talk, going green. Now, we all know there's been a pre-COVID and other things that have been happening in the world as of today and yesterday. There was a lot of interest in anthropomorphogenic change, so the impact that humans have on their environment. Except this goes back quite a long time. So right back, there we are. Right back in 930 AD, we started to change our climate. This is a modern day photograph of Iceland, and you can see in the foreground massive soil erosion. Now, most people think, well, you know, how did this happen? What caused it? Surely this is sitting in the same temporal belt that Alaska is and Siberia is in the far east of Russia. It should be heavily forested, except human intervention. Our friendly Vikings settled in Iceland, and then to build longships, deforested the entire island to the point that they actually had to abandon the settlement because they destroyed everything. We roll on into the 1930s, and if you've worked in the Free State, this is probably something which was familiar. But again, human intervention in the environment, operating in places or farming in places where the soil was not fit for purpose. So this is the Badlands of Dakota. Basically what happened is after the First World War, the American government had a plan to resettle a lot of servicemen farming in the prairie areas. The soil there was not very thick. The soil horizon is a very dry area. 5 years of drought happened and the entire area was decimated. Be that as it may, it also led to probably one of the most evocative images of the Great Depression. This is a photograph taken by Dorothea Lange of a lady called Florence Owen Thompson, who was on her way with her husband and family to find some work. They'd been destitute effectively for several years by that stage. And this was one of 7 photographs that were taken by that time. Most people, when they see this photograph, normally estimate that Florence's age was in her 50s to 60s. At this stage, she was 32 years old. But as we roll forward through time and a few world wars, acid rain, the ozone layer vanishing, we hit 2006, where Al Gore releases this documentary called An Inconvenient Truth, which sparked a whole debate about climate change, global warming, massive temperature changes because of humans. Now, this continued until 2015, where the politicians got together and signed the Paris Accords in Paris, where there was a general consensus that to change the way the economy is going, to change the way that the world environment is perceived to be going, we need to move away from our traditional sources of energy, which were coal, oil, and natural gas, because they're releasing carbon dioxide into the air. That carbon dioxide is alleged to create a change in the environmental conditions, changing the average temperature of the Earth, changing climatic conditions, and obviously impacting on humans. The date has obviously been a source of major controversy, and I'm not going to get into that debate. Suffice it to say, this is the situation we're currently in. The world is going to go green, like it or not. And this is some of the data that has been used. This is an update on the infamous hockey stick profile. And this is also just the way that people sort of look at graphs and actually don't sit and think about them. So a global temperature warming based on a datum, which again, how that datum is derived is not always clearly presented in some of the climatological studies which are presented. And then also just to see or understand that projecting up until 2025, you're effectively seeing a 1.2 degrees Celsius change in the overall temperature of the planet. Now, again, the argument then gets back to between climate denialists and those believing that this is occurring is, well, how do you measure that? What is the scientific rationale behind it? How do you average out the entire planet to say there's an average temperature rise? How do you take account in a city versus a desert, the ocean versus Antarctica? So again, be that as it may, we're going to make, or the decision has effectively been made that we are going green. We're going to move away from our traditional energy sources into renewable resources. And this is based on a study done by one of the EU think tanks, where in order for the EU to make or to meet the what's known as the 2DS goal of the Paris climate change, this is the type of energy mix that Europe will need to get to. Now, just to go back, the 2DS is 2 degrees Celsius. So from our baseline of 0, the whole rationale behind the Paris Accords is that for the average temperature of the entire Earth, we will not see an average temperature increase of more than 2 degrees Celsius. The actual base case that most of these studies work on is an average increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which again takes us to this energy mix, including things like solar, nuclear, wind power, capturing of the carbon which is available, bioenergy, and then also looking at the infrastructure which will be needed. So if you look in the metal side, you can see a lot of elements which we're aware of as geologists, but don't normally figure too much in an academic curriculum. Most of the time, we look at things like iron, steel, gold, copper, PGEs. But now we're starting to see interesting things popping up like hafnium, indium, ruthenium, which again is just not something which we deal with, or most geologists deal with in their day-to-day lives. Other interesting things that start popping up are what we refer to as the agro minerals or green minerals, which is phosphate and potassium, which are necessary for fertilizers to feed a growing world population. It's something I'm going to be reflecting on later on as we start moving through this presentation. One of the other studies which has been done indicates the relative proportion of mining that we're going to have to do. So by moving away from these sources of energy, so coal, oil, and gas are referred to as energy dense materials. So for a very low tonnage of that material, you create a lot of energy when you are burning it off. The modern or green technologies tend not to be as energy dense, so you tend to need more of them. Because our economy has not been structured to take into account the use of lots of metals and minerals, we're going to have to do significant amounts of mining. Now, as you can see in this table, for example, we're going to see a massive amount of growth in lithium to provide energy components to cars. Okay, lithium batteries are energy dense. The problem with a lot of the information that you start seeing is you need to then understand what the rationale is and what the assumptions are behind this. In this case, it's been projected out to a 2050 demand. So you need to take into account when you're doing these projections, what is the demographics of the world going to be, how our economy is going to develop, what is the percentage of a working class which are going to move up into a middle class environment. As soon as you want to get to middle class, as soon as people get to middle class type of standard of living, they want to live the American dream. And the American dream by default is more consumption of naturally occurring resources. What is also not always clear in some of the studies is a focus on the other metals which you will need to support the new green economy. So for example, in this slide, we see a massive increase in lithium, but at the same time, we don't see the same magnitude of increase in mining of aluminium, copper, and manganese, which are all critical components needed in, for example, lithium batteries. A lithium battery for people that aren't too aware of it, is composed mainly of copper with small amounts of lithium and small amounts of graphite. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. I would refer you, for example, to Robert Friedland's presentations, which are available on the Ivanhoe website. Really worthwhile going there, downloading them, and having a look at them. Oops, sorry. So, but the whole concept of this is now we have a supply and demand issue. We're going to have massive increases in supply because of our demand. But where they're going to be coming from? Now, as soon as people start hearing supply and demand, they start reacting emotively and thinking, well, you know, how am I going to supply this to my supply chain? And for some reason, people start thinking, well, if the material's in short supply, it means, or by default, it's geologically not available. Most of these metals and minerals, which are referred to as critical or strategic, actually are relatively common in the Earth's crust. The bigger issue is, can you mine them economically? And that's where the problems start coming in. So it's not so much a, do they occur? It's more of a, can we mine these economically? And the problem is, when you start looking at a Western supply and demand type of scenario, we predicate our economy on, are you going to make money out of it? In a centralized government like China or like the Soviet Union, when it existed, the same concept of supply and demand and profit economics don't apply. So if you need a resource, you would go and mine the resource because you need it. What we could also see is the concept of criticality, and by default, the concept of worth or value in these commodities change with time and accessibility. So as you can see, for example, in the Middle Ages, salt and pepper, for example, spices, were in really short supply and created their own level of demand. And if you had salt, you were very wealthy. The same thing goes with aluminium. As you can see here, aluminium back in the 1400s or the 1800s did not exist except in its oxidized state. So finding aluminium in its metallic state was incredibly rare. Therefore, supply and demand dictated that the value that people placed in aluminium was significantly higher than what it is today. Where with new technology, aluminium is cheap. We use it for everything and we throw it away. Your beer can, for example. But this whole concept of supply and demand goes back even further. In 1923, a gentleman called Leith published a book called The Economic Aspect of Geology. It's probably the first economic textbook that we understand, or the first textbook where economic geology is actually approached in the terms of economics. And this was based on America's experiences during the First World War, where because of the small incident happening in Europe, the American economy could not get in the supply of raw materials that they needed. So they suffered supply shortages and had to look at new places to source these minerals and metals from. And if you look at the list, and as we move on to the current priorities in the 21st century, you'll find things actually haven't changed. The applications of these metals and minerals have changed, but the requirement or the need for these metals and minerals haven't changed. Now, to use the American economy as an example, and the only reason for that is, one, the information is a lot easier to acquire. They publish a lot of information online, which is freely accessible. But also America contains effectively 5% of the world's population. During the Cold War, consumed 51% of the Western world's resources. And currently, with an opened economy where everybody trades, so globalization, America consumes about 31% of the entire world's natural resources. So again, America has a desire to ensure that its quality of life, its standard of living continues. Oh, just an aside, why Tutankhamun is there. In 1923, that's when Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, and also that's when Warner Brothers started. So moving forward into the 21st century, this is a study done by the European Union, and effectively every 5 to 7 years there's an update done in terms of what metals and minerals are considered to be critical to the successful functioning of the European economy. And as you can see, there's some interesting ones that start popping up. And I'm not going to discuss every single one in detail, but things like barite. Before, wasn't seen as being a critical metal or mineral, but barite now, because of the applications of modern technology such as LED lights, becomes important. But also, more importantly, barite is a critical component in the manufacturing of cement. Another thing which some people may think is quite interesting, why it suddenly pops up in a restricted metals and mineral list, is coking coal, especially given this whole concept of wanting to go green. Why are we still looking at coal then if we're trying to move away from coal? Well, something as simple and fundamental: you cannot make steel unless you are smelting rock. Smelting steel. And the only way we know with modern technology to make high strength steel in the smelting process to add carbon is by the use of coking coals. So some things are just not going to change, and some things we're going to have to live with on a day-to-day basis. But as we start moving through, so what are the type of issues that determine this whole supply and demand economic? What's the type of things that will prevent a metal becoming a critical or a bottleneck in your supply chain? Now, one of the biggest things that starts popping out, and again, we're going to see this as we continue through, is the geopolitical impacts. So a lot of the metals and minerals which are considered as being critical are controlled, or they're located in geographical locations where a country will then control the supply and demand because they're producing them significantly cheaper than anywhere else in the world. So again, getting back to our example of you need to mine to make money, or mining makes money. If you can't make money, you're not going to mine. Therefore, if you're a country like China, all you need to do is you just produce metals and materials at a price well below what any other mining company can then go and buy it or mine it for and make money out of. Other issues that we need to be aware of is if you have a significantly large deposit, referred to as a tier 1 deposit, just by increasing production, a single deposit can go and swamp the market for these critical metals. So for example, lithium. In Australia, the Greenbushes deposit, which is the world's largest hard rock lithium deposit, if they were to ramp up production, they could basically supply all lithium needs in the world. The same thing goes with the graphite. There's 1 or 2 graphite deposits in the world. Just by ramping up production, they will be able to provide the world's graphite needs for 100 years to come. The other problem is because these metals and minerals are generally not mined in the same amounts and volumes that, say, for example, gold or steel or aluminium are mined in, is small changes can have a massive impact on the price. And because of that, these aren't always traded on the spot on an open market like the LME. So a lot of times there will be a vertical market integration, and a company will then have a direct offtake with a specific metal supplier. This then results in monopolies. One of the things that we'll be touching on is the supply and demand for rare earths. What a lot of people aren't too familiar with is the Chinese supply of rare earths is controlled by 6 government-funded companies. So again, we're starting to look at monopolies. 6 companies control all the output from the Chinese rare earth market, and it's funded by the Chinese government, which then allows you to manipulate the market, as we'll see later on with the rare earths wars in China. A lot of the metals and minerals cannot be mined by themselves as a primary metal or mineral. You'll see in the literature if you start reading about some of these things, they're referred to as hitchhiker metals and minerals. They are a byproduct. You just don't produce them as a matter of course. A lot of the times the processing in and of itself is expensive, and a lot of these metals and minerals are environmentally unfriendly. So they're either carcinogenic, or they're highly toxic, or they're highly polluting. And due to that, then again, you have a concentration of processing plants or refineries in 1 or 2 geographical locations. And again, for example, rare earths or lithium and graphene, spherical graphite, they are all concentrated in China. So this is just a graphical way of trying to demonstrate the relationship between the economic importance of a metal or mineral to the European economy and or the supply risk. And what you will see, which is what a lot of people find quite shocking when they see this, is gold, for example, in the modern European economy is actually not seen as particularly critical, even though as soon as there's uncertainty in the market, everybody goes and buys up gold. What is probably more of interest, especially if you're in South Africa, is antimony. South Africa's got one of the world's largest antimony deposits. It's just not mined. Why? Because you cannot produce antimony from that deposit in an economically viable way because you're in competition or direct competition with Chinese supplies. And another thing just to be aware of is it's not just metals and minerals which are necessarily considered of being economic importance to the natural growth and the development of an economy. So peely wood is one of them. It is a hardwood, and it is the type of wood used to make musical instruments. Once again, the largest manufacturer of musical instruments in the world is China. So again, okay. So again, the supply and demand is very limited or is based on geographical locations. Somebody's got the microphone on. Could you please mute it if you don't mind? I'm getting lots of feedback. So where are these critical metals located? So this is research undertaken by, again, a European think tank, indicating where the concentrations of, or the supplies of a lot of these metals and minerals are located. As you can see, China dominates the world supply for a whackload of the metals and minerals that we consider or is considered necessary for a functioning modern economy. And if we're going to then start looking at it from an economic point of view, and I've based this on European information, because again, it's next to the American stuff is probably the next most accessible. These are the countries that supply the European Union with metals and minerals which are considered critical to the European economy. And again, once again, you can see how dependent Europe is on the BRICS economies. So China, Brazil, and Russia, which will then drive, or which is driving the European economy to develop things like Horizon 2020, which is to try and make the European Union independent or less dependent on supplies of these metals and materials from Russia, Brazil, and China. And these are the type of steps that people take. So again, you're probably thinking, well, how is this sort of turning into this going green thing? Well, the whole point is that we want to go green. We have to change the world's economy or the energy supplies to power that economy. And the only way to do it is by developing or getting involved in these new technologies. The only way we can get involved in these new technologies is by the use of additional mining and the use of a lot of, well, what most people refer to as exotic metals and minerals. And these are the 3 points that most people rely on. The first one being the so-called circular economy, where we go and take metals and materials, we don't just dump them, we recycle, or we start looking at a lot more detail in terms of natural resources which can be renewable, such as biogas and biofuels. So the question then is, do we actually recycle and how much? This is based on a study done in America, again, because it's the world's largest consumer of raw material. And this is the type of numbers that came out. But again, when you start analyzing a lot of this data, it's not always exactly what you think. So for example, you can see it appears that there's 100% recycling of steel in cars. That doesn't mean that the steel in a car goes back into another car. The problem with recycling of cars is there's a high copper component in a car. So when it goes through a mechanical crusher and gets ripped up, all that metal is then separated using magnets, but there's still a small component of copper which will then go into the smelt. As soon as you have copper in a steel smelt, the copper causes the iron to lose its inherent strength. So you can't use, in a lot of cases, recycled steel for high strength components. So that steel, while it's being recycled, is not necessarily going into the same use it came from. In the same way, most people get quite surprised when they find out that, yes, you're recycling paper, but paper can only be recycled about 5 times before the wood fibers become too short to actually form a bond and make paper. In that case, it's either dumped as a sludge and used for fertilizer or briquetted to be used for energy. Which then takes us to something which is quite interesting, and economists have noticed this over time. As soon as we have new technology, i.e. our resources used more efficiently, the prices of those commodities drop. So say, for example, your iPhone, when they first came out, they're really expensive. In relative terms, that price has dropped, which means more and more people buy iPhones. So you're not actually creating a sensible use of the commodity. People are being able to buy more of the commodity because it comes cheaper. And the same thing, as soon as things become more energy efficient, the prices drop because of supply and demand. So people then start using more energy. So what was done in the past is to start looking for substitution. And this is probably one of the most interesting things that I came across when I was doing some research for this. Plastic has been with us for a lot longer than what we think. A lot of the plastic products were created as, at the time when they were created, as logical replacements and substitutes which for elements and metals and minerals which were in short supply and demand. So say, for example, sticky tape. At that stage, most people used string and sealing wax for packaging and parcels. Sticky tape was a cheaper and more effective solution to using string. The same way in 1935, nylon became a substitute and replacement for silk. 1941, polyester became a replacement for cotton. In 1948, we had Velcro, which helped replace metal zippers. And so things developed. And the reason why is, well, we had all the stuff coming out of crude oil. It was getting distilled, and you could use one or two components, and the rest of the stuff was just getting burnt off. So these were logical developments from an environmental preservation point of view. Or so it was thought at that stage. An interesting thing as well, in 1933, polyethylene was developed. Polyethylene is basically what plastic bags are made out of nowadays. The inventor of the plastic bag did so because he saw paper bags or raffia bags would not be used for long periods of time. They would get wet, they'd tear, and there was a deforestation issue associated with it. The logic at that stage behind plastic bags was, well, plastic bag doesn't get wet, it doesn't tear, and if people use them, they will last forever. So we get back to our postulates as we've had here. Because plastic bags then became very cheap, plastic bags were considered as being worthless, so people just didn't take any care of a plastic bag, and because they're not biodegradable, they cause issues. The other interesting thing, so refer to 1941 polyester. Polyester we see in a huge number of applications. So polyester, or PET plastic, is used for clothes. It is also used in plastic bottles, and it's used for cheap plastic takeaway containers. And again, the interesting thing, why polyester was developed and why polyester was used is cotton, when you grow it, cotton plants take all the nutrients away from the soil and effectively sterilize the soil. So for cotton farmers to keep the crop harvest at the levels that they needed to be economically viable, started using more or higher and higher levels of artificial fertilizer. The fertilizer would then get washed off with rain. Fertilizers would then enter the water system, so rivers. The additional phosphate in the water would cause algal blooms. Algal blooms would then cause oxidization of the water, which would cause fish death, and you were basically killing off your streams. So at that stage, polyester was seen as a viable alternative to using cotton. Cotton, just out of interest, one pair of jeans, if you go and work out how much water is used, to manufacture one pair of jeans, it is generally assumed or estimated that you need 30,000 liters of water. During that process, most of that water is contaminated to the point it's no longer potable, and it's either grey water or has to be disposed of as being polluted water. The problem, though, however, with plastic and with all the applications of plastic is that most of it isn't actually recyclable. So plastic bottles are recyclable, but all the other stuff that we use in our day-to-day lives is not necessarily recyclable. Now, on the slide, the one thing I would like you to just remember is number 3, polyvinyl chloride, and what it's used for, specifically in terms of cable insulation. So moving on, so how do we start going to compensate for this lack of metals and materials? Well, obviously is exploration ongoing. But as we know, and this is from Richard Schroeder's website, so again, if you go to Minex Consulting, they've got some really interesting presentations there. Regardless of the exploration spend, we're seeing fewer and fewer new major discoveries being found. Yes, there are some of them, like Ivanhoe's Kamoa-Kakula project. So again, I'd refer you back to the GSSA website and watch George's really interesting presentation. But overall, we're actually not seeing or replacing the resources that we need. Now, remember what I said in terms of America, 5% of the world's population consuming 30% of the world's resources. Imagine what's going to happen as soon as China, India, Bangladesh, Turkey, Nigeria, Brazil all start moving up the economic value curve and moving from emerging in primary industries to emerging in quaternary industries. So where do we find some of these things? As you can see, specific geographical locations for some of these metals and minerals. And again, which some of you, if you've been looking at these diagrams and charts, will say, but just wait, this is different to the previous ones. And that's a further point I'm trying to make, is that you need to go back and interrogate the data that you're seeing in some of these studies that start getting presented. The information is not always concise. The USGS, for example, did some studies on rare earths, graphite, and lithium, and at no stage did they actually notice or note that South Africa or Africa per se had quite significant deposits of those metals and minerals on the continent, because it just didn't exist in their databases at that stage. So just running around the world, well, where do we see some major lithium deposits? Now, again, the perception out in the market is lithium is in short supply. It's not. This is only hard rock lithium, but we also know in this part of South America, there's massive low-grade salar deposits where you can process lithium really cheaply. Greenbush is located in Australia, world's largest operational lithium project. Just by ramping up their production, they can pretty much collapse the rest of the world's lithium supply, or they can supply lithium to the rest of the world with no problems. And that's what WEEE, a big project in Canada, ran into. They just could not compete in terms of supply and demand and the amount of infrastructure that they needed to create lithium carbonates and lithium hydroxides. In South Africa, or in Africa, I should say, there's the Bikita project, privately owned, so there's not a lot of information around about it, but this has a really, really high grade and high quality spodumene coming out of it. Cobalt, similar type of thing. World's major resources of cobalt are located, as we all know, in the DRC and partially in Zambia. There's large cobalt deposits on the sea floor, but again, we're now looking at real depths below the ocean, 2-3 kilometers, environmental issues, and costs associated. Graphite as well, as you can see from this diagram. Graphite, even though it's considered as being a critical metal for economies, the fact that there's massive amounts of graphite available in the world. The biggest problem is, as I've referred to beforehand, is that China is the country with the largest graphite manufacturing and processing capacity in the world. So just by default, in terms of pure economics, they will be able to undercut anyone. And the last slide, in terms of having a look at these, this is an example of what is referred to as passenger metals or minor metals, sorry, and minor metals and elements. As you can see, most of them occur associated with larger deposits or different types of deposits. So looking at VMS deposits, which are mainly mined for copper, lead, and zinc, you have all these associated minor metals and minerals which are needed. So yes, they do exist. The problem starts coming in, can you process them out economically? From a processing point of view, are they going to cause you environmental problems and contamination? And is it going to be worth your while as a company to start processing these things out? And this is an example of, the next slide is an example of a commodity which is actually really common, but because it's controlled by one country, it can have a significant impact on the supply chain. So rare earths, they're not rare at all. But what happened back in 2000 is the Chinese, in a bit of a trade war with America, decided to restrict the export of both heavy and light rare earths from China. Part of that was because they were doing their own environmental clampdown in China, because they discovered that, you know, with processing these things, they're actually contaminating their own countryside. So there was a pullback and a shutdown of small and unlicensed rare earth manufacturing facilities or mining facilities, as well as then the combination of the remaining larger deposits into these six state-owned companies. That then led to a major spike in the price of rare earths. Probably the other thing which is of interest to note at this stage is back in 1963, the Chinese government identified that rare earths are going to be the new oil of the 21st century. So the Chinese government, back from the 60s into the 70s, had already started a plan and strategy to look at potentially, I wouldn't say controlling rare earths, but at least identifying rare earths as a driving force going into the world economy as we see it today. So if we can't find this stuff on land and they're controlled by other people, well, where can we go? Well, undersea mining is a potential. And there are large deposits of metals and minerals on the sea floor. But the thing is, well, how do we go and mine it? And we're going to have to take a major mindset step away from conventional mining technologies to mining robotically under the water. The problem with this type of concept, however, is one, there's a cost involved, there's economies of scale involved. You're not going to be able to move huge amounts of rock because the ship size is going to be limited. But then also there's kickback in terms of environmental pollution. Because remember, once this is all pumped up, you're going to be dumping stuff back into the ocean floor. And as a byproduct of some of these nodules, as we saw in previous slides, there's some pretty nasty stuff which will be concentrated, such as cadmium and arsenic, potentially uraniums. And this is now going to be released back into the seafloor. And if you have studied oceanographic processes, one of the other things that does occur in the ocean is this two major currents, one a top current which we see and aware of, but there's a bottom current which has about 1,000-year cycle where it moves along the bottom of the ocean very slowly, but it picks up all that metal and material and then resurfaces again in the Antarctic and drops that metal and those metals and material back into the ocean. We could also start looking at mining in outer space. Again, it's not as science fiction as what people would think. NASA has been actively investigating it. There's been about 12 companies in America which have started and failed looking at this type of stuff. But for more information on this, Dr. Larry Minert is going to be giving a talk on space-based resources, which I'm looking forward to as well. I think that's in a week's time, but Nolene will give us some more information at the end of this. But after all of this are new technologies. Sometimes, like plastic, there may be some unexpected consequences. So things done in the best of intentions may have kickbacks which we weren't anticipating. Probably the one that we're all familiar with is what's referred to as WEEE. All your electrical components, so when you throw things away, they don't always get recycled in the way you think they do. A lot of the times, they end up dumped in landfills or get reprocessed. Now, just looking at this is supposedly electronic equipment, but if you look over here, there's a child's plastic car, there's a plastic bucket here, what looks to be a sink sitting over here. There's plenty of metal cabling coming through this, and pipes and tubes. Now, remember, a lot of that material is PVC, polyvinyl chlorides, so thermal plastic with chlorine in it. So this is just an example of what these type of things are. Now, this is the type of thing that most people will aspire to. As soon as you've got money and disposable income, you would like a fridge, or you're going to like a microwave, or you're going to like a new cell phone, or you're going to like a new camera. And as you have disposable income, as soon as you can buy the next best model, you will dispose of your old model and get the new one. And as I said, this stuff just gets dumped in the recycling bin and vanished. And most people sort of will think they've done their duty as a good corporate citizen, they've disposed of it, and now we're moving on. This was a study done in America in about 2019, where America was saying, well, they've got major recycling programs, so like New York, Los Angeles, and they were taking material to be recycled. What happened is the majority of material was going to China in Hong Kong. But then what was happening is that material was then getting moved into the hinterland to rural areas which were relatively poverty stricken. And as we'll see in the next slide, it was causing a lot of local environmental degradation. A lot of other material was going to emerging economies, again, where there's high poverty levels. So the local community were taking the American largesse and they were reprocessing it coming through. And this gets back, especially in the case of China, that again, because of the Chinese government seeing the impact of this reprocessing of Western largesse and taking effectively Western pollution into their own country, they started what's referred to as the National Sword Initiative, basically banning the import of plastics into China. The effect that that has had is large American cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles no longer run recycling programs because they can't make money out of them. What tends to happen there is that the material now just gets dumped in landfills or goes to plants where the plastic's crushed and then it's burnt to create energy. So what's the reality like of some of these reprocessing things? This is an example from Ghana. If you go and start researching it, there's quite a lot of heated debates in terms of the realities. Does this really occur in Ghana or not? Whether the specific case is 100% accurate, I think is rather beside the point. The point is to strip polyvinyl chloride off cable to get to the copper, aluminium, or steel that's in them. It's not easy to do, and you need to burn it off. These fumes are highly toxic and highly carcinogenic. So the reality is these young men are probably going to be reducing the lifespan by 20 or 30 years just to try and get enough food to survive on and to feed the families. In a similar way, a lot of people may have seen on YouTube, there's a video going around about what appears to be a Chinese lady reprocessing tin cans or aluminium tin cans and making basins out of it. Again, she's not wearing any PPE. Aluminium fumes are known to cause Alzheimer's disease and a whole lot of other motor neuron conditions. So you think, okay, that's great, but we've gone green. And we're using windmills. The unfortunate thing with windmills is they're great, except you can't recycle the blades of a windmill. Now, a lot of people get a bit freaked out about this. It's actually quite true if you do the research. A windmill blade on a wind turbine, land-based wind turbine, has got a lifespan between 20 to 35 years. The problem is the amount of energy it will take to break down the carbon graphite compounds used for these wind turbine blades is more than what it will be to make blades from scratch. So what tends to happen, as you can see here, is these wind turbine blades end up getting buried in massive landfills. And as you can see, because of the drive to go green, because of the drive that windmills are environmentally friendly, they don't pollute, there's a massive amount of windmill farms being built. Current estimates are as you can see here, in America, 2,000 windmills will 2,000 blades are going to have to be disposed of per year. And Europe at the moment, they're looking at 3,800 plus per year. And we can't do anything with them. A similar thing goes for solar. And again, most people don't really know this. In terms of solar panels, you can't actually recycle solar panels at the moment, or at least it's not cost effective. And a lot of solar panels contain some quite nasty things, amongst other things, plastic. And as you can see, the lead, cadmium, and arsenic. The way that most solar panels are disposed of is they will get crushed. What can be recycled, for example, steel will be recycled, and the rest of the material gets buried in the landfill. So how do we move to our green future? And this is a slide I've shown before in an interactive environment and ask people, well, out of these options, which is the one that you really think is going to be worth our time and effort to invest in? And just looking at it, most people tend to go for hydropower. Again, it makes sense. It's water, we're generating electricity, but the few realities of the situation sort of boil down to, if you start thinking and analyzing the problem a little bit further, there's only so many large rivers you can dam. As soon as you start damming rivers, you start changing the local climatic conditions. You end up with turf wars. For example, the fractured or rather tense relationships between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, Kenya at the moment, or because of various countries starting to dam the source of the Nile or some of the other large regional rivers. It also has some dramatic impacts on local people. Take for example, the 10 Gorges Dam in China. Massive, but how many people had to then move, and the local changes in climatic condition. So hydro by itself doesn't always necessarily bring the best solution to the table. We've already had a look at what wind is going to do, and we've already had a look at some of the implications of solar power. Geothermal, we know, is not widely available, so that's going to be very limited. Or we can look at nuclear, but obviously people have a visceral issue in terms of nuclear after Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. The other thing is, so we decide we're going to stay with hydro. The other problem is hydro power needs dams. Dam needs concrete. Concrete means cement. And this is the problem when you start making large infrastructures. Cement, in and of itself, the manufacturing process produces carbon dioxide. So if we're going to see this quantum leap in building of infrastructure, we are going to see, by default, an increase in carbon fume emissions just because we're manufacturing cement. And the final thing is our growing world population. As I said before, I referred to a few times, currently America is about 5% of the world's population, consumes an estimated 31%, if not more, of the world's total natural resources. Compare that to countries like India and China, which are massive emerging economies. China at the moment, depending on the metrics you use, is as big, if not bigger, than America. Its growing middle class will want, or does want, to emulate the American lifestyle, have a car, have a computer, have a camera, have a cell phone. That all has to come from somewhere. The same thing, India, very close behind China in terms of population. They're also developing. I mean, China and India both have nuclear weapons programs. They are launching astronauts into space, or the Indians will be, I think, in 2 years' time. They've got moon missions. They have Mars missions. They're not poor countries per se. There's a lot of poverty, but as they're developing, they're getting richer and richer. As they start getting richer and richer, the expectations of the population are going to increase. And it's going to be a case of wanting the same type of lifestyle that the Western world has, so Europe and America. So, as Kermit the Frog would say, it's not easy going green.
Thank you very much, Mark. Nolene, do you want to take over now, or should I carry on?
You can carry on, Craig.
Okay. Look, we'd like to take some question and answers. Before we do that, and before we get to the end, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the month, which is GeoExplore Store, and Dennis Blewett. He helps us put on these lectures by financing a little bit of it, so we appreciate that very much. I'll take questions and comments now from the floor. Just unmute your mic and go ahead, or raise your hand. I'd like to start off. Mark, you haven't said anything about reprocessing tailings dumps. Is that an option for some of these critical metals?
It is, Craig. I just think I actually went way over what I had. So there's some things I had to give. Yes, there's a lot of activity looking at reprocessing tailings dams. I think Ernest Hemingway has got a big program underway looking at reprocessing some of those. There was a lot of interest in the BCL dumps at one stage. The problem sometimes it comes in is once you process using to recover a specific metal or mineral, by default you lock up the remaining elements within your tailings, and you can't always reprocess those out if you're looking for tailings after processing. In other cases, yes, you can come back and reprocess. The East project in Namibia is a classic case in point, going back and reprocessing those tailings using new technology or more efficient recovery methods.
Any other questions or comments?
Craig, there's something under the chat.
Okay, hold on, I'll have a look. Just a comment. Excellent presentation on the externalities for the energy transition we're facing. It looks like we should be going nuclear with improvements of disposal techniques. Why isn't it being promoted? Would you like to respond to that?
Well, Jacques, I think it's because of people's, I guess, visceral fear of nuclear. Last year, I had the interesting experience of going to Chernobyl, and it was quite interesting being there on site of the world's largest nuclear disaster, and just people's reactions are, you know, in terms of this absolute paranoia that people have got in terms of radioactivity. There's a very interesting book, and I can't remember the author, but it's called Coal: A Social History. If you go back in terms of mining of coal, environmental issues related to coal, deaths caused by coal directly and indirectly, coal has killed more people in the same time period than nuclear energy has, including allegedly the two atom bombing events in Japan during the Second World War. I think it's emotional, it's psychological. I personally am a big believer in nuclear power, but I just don't think it's politically expedient at the moment.
David, you've got your mic unmuted.
Yes, I have a question. The whole issue of rare earth element mining and exploration, and the whole issue that we are so dependent upon China for the rare earths, and it's producing a huge amount of radioactive pollution in China, and it would seem to be the responsible thing for the world to simply take higher cost rare earths from the rest of the world, where the thorium has expensively been removed and either responsibly disposed of, or somehow someone's found some kind of use for the thorium. And that, of course, brings up the whole issue of the possibility of nuclear power generation from thorium. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that, Mark.
Okay, it's one of those. If Professor Jock Harmer was on the line, he's probably the South Africa's expert in that. So that being said, let's tackle the first aspect. Yes, there are the other deposits which can be mined effectively. The problem is, and again, it's one of those things that came out when I was doing some additional research for this presentation. America shut down I think it's called Mountain Pass, which is their primary source of heavy rare earth elements in, I think, the 80s. They've tried to reestablish it a few times. With President Trump, he wants to be more autonomous, except what then came out of the wash is very quietly in the past. There's one of the Chinese parastatals, I think, have got a 15% interest in Mountain Pass.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect. The other, because rare earths from China, and in fact, it's not even just getting the rare earths. I mean, Steenkampskraal in South Africa is one of them. There's a number of projects in Namibia. The problem's not so much mining the things, it's getting the processing. Most countries, because of the issues involved in radioactivity and carcinogenics, don't want them. I think the UK had a processing factory, which they've shut down. The only other place which will readily take rare earths appears to be China. So again, even if you can mine the stuff successfully, you're still stuck into the problem, well, where do you take it to go and get processed? And that's one of the other issues that, you need to get sorted out, is where do you process the stuff? In terms of thorium, India has the world's largest thorium deposits, and I believe the Indians have worked on thorium reactors for a number of years. But my understanding, and I stand corrected in this, is they're still not as cost effective as using your standard uranium reactor. And I guess from a geopolitical point of view, you can have a thorium reactor, but you can't make plutonium from a thorium reactor. You can only get plutonium from a uranium reactor. So if you want to be a nuclear power, thorium is not really the way to go if you're going to be looking at where you want to invest your money from a military point of view in the changing global politics scenario.
Okay, thank you very
Mark.
much.
We have one more question that I see someone's got their mic unmuted.
Would like to?
Yes, carry on.
Yes. Thanks, Mark, for the very informative talk. My question is just simply that, okay, with the challenges that we have going green, like your presentation says, it's not as easy as it seems. Are we doing more harm, not striving towards going green? Because like you did mention, there's a lot of factors involved in actually going green. So what if we just decided not to go green? Are we doing any harm by staying not green?
I think to answer that question, I don't want to have given the impression that I'm not environmentally conscious. I think most geologists are actually very environmentally conscious, and most mining people, surprisingly more so than what people think we are. I think it's more of a case of with, before COVID and Black Lives Matter and stuff, there was all this drive to go green, go green, go green. So I was walking past an extinction group protest in London, and there was a lady standing there with a plastic sign saying hydrocarbons must remain in the ground. So it's sort of a dichotomy. Yes, we want to go green, but we need to understand that there is going to be implications with that. I don't think there's any easy solutions at all. I think we should be good stewards of the world's resources. We need to understand the implications of our actions currently on future generations. But what the final answer is going to be, I honestly don't know. When you start looking at it from a very clinical point of view, purely economics, oil, gas, and coal are still the most cost-effective energy sources that we have. Whether we can then have the interest to develop the technology to get rid of the problems that are inherent with burning of all those materials, that's a totally different subject. What I do think is probably important is that the solutions which are currently being offered do come with their own, or can come with their own long-term problems, which you just actually haven't seen. I get back to the example of the gentleman that created the plastic bag. He did that with the best of intentions. And look at the consequences now, 70 years down the line. I don't think was anything he even conceived that plastic would become so cheap, people just, dump it on the side of the road because they can go and get another plastic bag for nothing.
No, thank you.
And sorry I didn't answer the question. I don't think there's any easy answers. And I guess the whole point of this is, people seem to think there's an easy answer. Let's just build a windmill. But, then there's a turbine blades, then there's the rare earths which you need for the magnets, then there's this disposal of that. What people also don't necessarily always understand is all those turbines and windmills need lubrication. So either you are stuck with a hydrocarbon type lubrication, so oil is still on the table, or you need to start looking at synthetic silicon-based stuff or lithium-based stuff, which again gets you back into you need to mine the stuff. So there's always going to be, I guess, a tension between going green and what we need to go green.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess also the fact that with the technologies that need to be implemented, like a lot of maybe studying into how these resources can be mined is also another factor to look into.
Well, the thing is, as I said, if you start looking at it from a purely economic point of view, there are resources, but because the market or the Western economies are currently is structured, and in fact the definitions in JORC or SAMREC is a resource is the potential for eventual economic extraction. If you can't extract it economically, you're never going to mine it unless you've got a government like, say, for example, a demand economy, or sorry, a centralized economy like China will say go and mine regardless of the cost in terms of economics. So so unless maybe we change the whole way that the world economy operates, you're still again going to be stuck into that. Well, we can't mine it. We're not going to make money. Therefore, we're not going to mine it, and you then still become dependent on a China or a Russia or Brazil or South Africa for platinum. South Africa is the world's manganese, platinum, manganese, platinum, and chrome. And South Africa supplies that to the world.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? I'd just like to make one myself. It seems to me from this excellent presentation, and it's something we've all been thinking about, but maybe we as a geological community should go beyond exploration and extraction and into the risks, the long-term risks associated with usage and disposal. And maybe we're not seeing enough of that. Who takes ownership of that whole problem? And with that, I'll hand over to Nalin. Nalin, would you like to close?
Thanks, Craig. Just before we do, could we have a quick look at that poll that was up when we started?
Okay, end polling. Can everybody see that on the screen? Show results.
There we go. It's really nice to see so many people from Botswana.
It looks like we have a real variety of attendees.
It does look like it. Great, thanks, Craig. As Mark mentioned, we have some interesting talks coming up next week. We have Dr. Herman Dorland on Tuesday. Larry Maynard's going to be talking about space resources on Wednesday. And we have Prof. Andrew Green talking about the heart of darkness on Friday. I'll leave you to go and have a look at the calendar and get more information on those. And that's all from me.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.